Alright, this is post 68, and I'm going to read Directing the Mind with Liber 3 Vel Judorum, which really was just an intro to my reading of that and making a video. And I said today or tonight, depending on where you are, I read Liber 3 Vel Judorum as a part of my daily practice and journal going down the line of Libers in the AA curriculum. We will take the teachings provided in this book for any and all future endeavors when the necessity arises. Being an extremely useful treatise, it is placed in the beginning stages of the work, because the mind is the most important weapon of the mage. I said Liber 3 Vel Judorum as a tool for self-control. Comment. Existence as we know it is full of sorrow. See Liber Aba, or Book 4, beginning next. Sabe di dukkam, all is dukkha. The formula of existence, known as the key of it all, is expressed in all the infinite numbers which are keys to the power that is also infinite. However, the number particularly attributed to man and given as a key for his understanding so that he may overcome these sorrows is 666, which is that also of the power of the sun, as well as the force and knowledge of the sum of all progress known as the evolution from the one central point, known as the bang point, from which the intelligence of the universe perceived itself through, as, and by light. The Freemason God of Light, known as the Grand Architect or Cosmic Fractal Intelligence, veiled under 666, by secret Masonic Kabbalah, is simply the magical light body. It is through the magus' rituals that this light is generated, but it must first be given an adequate vessel through the physical exercises accordingly needed, and the initiate's discipline shall be focused on rightly directing that force in a pointed and focused manner, as if it were to become the one central point around which all else revolves. Again, as the circle, 666, represents the initiate's process as well as the evolutionary process of all. If thy will be God's will, then thou art that. Remember, all ye, that existence is pure joy, that all the sorrows are but as shadows. They pass and are done, but there is that which remains. Liber AL, chapter 2, verse 9. Hear me, ye people of sighing, the sorrows of pain, and are left the dead and the dying, the folk that not know me as yet. AL chapter 2, verse 17. Is God to live in a dog? No, but the highest are of us. They shall rejoice, our chosen. Who sorroweth is not of us. AL chapter 2, verse 19. There is a veil, that veil is black. It is the veil of the modest woman. It is the veil of sorrow, and the pall of death. This is none of me. Tear down that lying spectre of the centuries. Veil not your vices in virtuous words. These vices are my service, ye do well, and I will reward you here and hereafter. AL chapter 2, verse 52. Fear not, O prophet, when these words are said. Thou shalt not be sorry. Thou art emphatically my chosen, and blessed are the eyes that thou shalt look upon with gladness. But I will hide thee in a mask of sorrow. They that see thee shall fear thou art fallen, but I lift thee up. AL chapter 2, verse 53. Chapter 2 of the Ancient Secret in Search of the Holy Grail, the Cauldron of Inspiration and Wisdom. Both Mr. Alfred Nutt in The Legend of the Holy Grail and Monsieur Potvin in the preface to his first printing of Chrétien's Conte du Graal came to the conclusion that all these tales have a Celtic origin, and that the talismanic vessel was the old Celtic cauldron of inspiration and wisdom. But they do not postulate any theory as to what the ancient cauldron was. Time and again, the knight in quest of the Grail is bidden to ask what the vessel is used for, and to what purpose, and by whom. That he never receives a straight answer to such questions merely underlines the fact that we are dealing here with a mystery which it was not lawful to disclose to the uninitiate. But the very terms of the question show, I think, that if the vessel had a Celtic origin, these Celts would not have composed lays in honor of a vessel which never had material existence in time and space. They might, and probably did, sing in honor of wisdom in the quest for it, but to connect the abstract idea of wisdom with a cauldron indicates that some definite ritual or story must first have brought the two together. To stress the point by analogy, men would never have thought to connect the words chalice and holiness if Christ had not on a certain day in time and space taken a material cup into his hands and instituted the Last Supper. To suggest that a certain symbol could represent the abstract idea of wisdom without some such definite history of its use and purpose by mankind savors of the bogus mysticism of a late and degenerate kind, favored in the 18th and early 19th centuries, but almost certainly foreign to the minds of an early and virile people. Our enquiries into the Celtic origin of the legend will be fruitless, therefore, unless we can discover what exactly the ancient cauldron was and why it was venerated. Miss Jessie Weston did at least postulate an answer to this question. She realized the undoubted similarities between these legends of the Grail and the cults of the vegetation gods of the Near East, Attis, Adonis, and others of the same type. She understood rightly that the whole purpose of achieving the talismans was to restore the land, the widowed earth, to life and the renewed vigor of springtime, and she therefore jumped to the conclusion that the spear and the Grail represented in Celtic fashion the symbols of the male and female powers of reproduction, which are so frequently found in the ritual of the Near East. The craze to see these particular symbols everywhere and in everything appertaining to religion was a great temptation to the writers of the end of the last century, for it was something very new to the Victorian mind, and to express it in bold print required a certain courage. But the theory, however courageous, does not in fact fit the legends of the Grail, for if the spear is held to be the symbol of the male powers, then what does the broken sword signify? And if the reverse is held to be the case, then what are we to make of the spear? In due course, I believe I shall be able to satisfy the reader that the Grail is in fact the symbol of all earthly matter, including all natural generative powers, and that the spear or its effluence represents, on the contrary, the entry of the divine into matter. I must not, however, anticipate, for we shall not be able to judge fairly unless we first attempt to enumerate the very little which has come down to us in manuscript form concerning this mysterious cauldron of the Celts. When in mythical times the Tuatha De Danann, literally the folk of the god whose mother is Dana, or Dana, invaded Ireland, they brought with them 4 treasures: the Stone of Destiny, a magic spear, the Sword of Lugh, the god of light and a patron of craftsmen, and the cauldron of the god Dagda, the All-Father. This vessel had the property that it could feed a host of men without ever being emptied. From the Irish manuscripts, little more is known of it than the story of its arrival in Ireland and the fact that it was inexhaustible. Another magic cauldron is mentioned in the Welsh account, the story of Branwen, the daughter of Lear, in the Mabinogion, translated by Lady Charlotte Guest, of Bran, king of Britain, who gave his sister Branwen in marriage to the king of Ireland. With her as dowry she took a wonderful cauldron, which had the property that if a dead man were cast into it, he would come forth well and sound, except that he would be unable to speak. The Irish king ill-treated Branwen, and her brother Bran sailed to her rescue. His arrival on the shores of Ireland portrays the characteristics of a solar hero or god, for he is described as being as big as a mountain, no ship could contain him, a mountain ridge was his nose, and 2 lakes were his eyes. There was war, and the Irish heated the magic cauldron and restored their dead to life, until at last one of Bran's warriors broke the cauldron, and thus enabled the British to gain victory. Bran was nevertheless mortally wounded in the foot by a poisoned arrow. He therefore commanded his followers to cut off his head and take it back to bury in the White Hill, London's Tower Hill. They did so, and for the 7 years of their journey, the head remained oracular and able to converse with them. In another Welsh myth, the story of Math, the son of Mathonwy, in the Mabinogion of Lady Charlotte Guest, Lugh, the sun god or solar hero, could be either slain or changed into an eagle by means of a spear, which must have been a year in the making and have been worked upon only during the sacrifice of the Mass on Sundays. That is to say that no true Christian ought to have occupied himself in making it, for it was used in pagan ritual. The spear was thrown at Lugh while he had one foot on a dead buck and the other in a cauldron prepared for his bath. In a poem by the Welsh bard Taliesin is described a cauldron which was part of the spoils of Hades, Anwyn or Ufern as it was known in Wales, and which was brought from the Underworld by King Arthur. The first word from the cauldron, when it was spoken, by the breath of 9 maidens it was gently warmed. Is it not the cauldron of the chief of Anwyn? What is its fashion? A rim of pearls is round its edge. It will not cook the food of a coward or one forsworn. A sword flashing bright will be raised to him, and left in the hand of Lemonog. And before the door of the gate of Ufern, the lamp was burning, when we went with Arthur a splendid labour. Except 7, none returned from Caer Vedwid. This translation is that given by T.W. Rolleston in Myths and Legends of the Celtic Race, page 410. Taliesin the Bard is a more or less historical character, but there was a mythical Taliesin, whose birth is connected with a magic cauldron. See the story of Taliesin in the Mabinogion. The goddess Ceridwen had an ill-favored son, and to compensate for his lack of beauty, she resolved to make him a sage. She began therefore to boil a cauldron of inspiration and science. It might not cease to boil for a year and a day, and her young servant Gwion was set to guard it. But the magic liquor flew out of the cauldron onto Gwion's finger. He sucked it and was at once endowed with the supernatural insight which had been intended for Ceridwen's own son. She pursued him with all her wrath, and to escape her, he changed himself into many different shapes until he became a grain of wheat, and she became a hen who swallowed him. He entered her womb and was born as her son. She would have killed him, but could not bring herself to the deed on account of his beauty, so she wrapped him in a leather bag and cast him into the sea. The story of how he was found and given the name of Taliesin will concern us later. For the present, it is necessary to review what we can learn from these myths. The inexhaustible cauldron of the Dagda, or Dagda, is connected with a king's throne, a magic spear, and the sword of the sun god, and, as we have seen, a special seat at the round table. A spear and a sword are associated with the Grail. In the story of Lugh, the sun god, the spear, the stag, and the cauldron are all brought together. He who finds the cauldron of Hades will find in his hand a sword flashing bright, and a lamp burning. Finally, wisdom and life are to be found within the vessel, and there is a suggestion that the vessel or the spear are prepared for use at regular intervals of a year and a day. Now, before we can put a definite name to the vessel and at last explain the mystery, we shall have to examine first the names of the heroes of the Grail legend, for in them lies the clue. Miss Weston has pointed out, in The Legend of Sir Percival, J.L. Weston, that although several knights are mentioned as being concerned in the quest, In fact, only two, a father and son, play the principal roles. Each locality had its particular way of naming this father and son, and as a more civilized way of life gradually brought one tribal region into closer touch with another, these heroes each and all had to find their place in the story. Miss Weston came to the conclusion, and I think rightly, that the most ancient hero was Gawain, son of King Lot, and in turn father of the Belle Incarnue. In time he was superseded by Perceval and his son, the Swan Knight, and Perceval in his turn had to yield first place to Lancelot and his son Galahad. By the time that Mallory came to write, Gawain had degenerated into a coarse buffoon. Nevertheless, if the legends are examined with care, it will be found that in fact each of these knights undergoes almost exactly the same adventures. Indeed, it is this very duplication which tends to make the legends long and tedious. Gawain, Lancelot, and Perceval all in turn visit the Chapel of the Black Hand, the Chapel Perilous. Perceval and Lancelot both visit a haunted chapel for the purpose of removing Christ's grave clothes, that is to say, of removing a veil from a cup. Perceval receives a broken sword from the Fisher King. Gawain wins the sword with which St. John the Baptist was beheaded. Lancelot draws his sword from a roof tree. Yet, as I shall show, these three swords are in fact one and the same. All three knights behold the Grail, and all three are concerned in the cure of a sick man. Finally, Arthur himself plays the major role in these adventures. He visits a strange chapel wherein his squire was wounded in the thigh for stealing a candlestick. He possesses, as we know from Mallory, the magic sword Excalibur, also the magic spear Ron, and he is one of those to behold the Grail. Now Gawain in the Welsh versions of the Arthurian legend goes by the name of Gwalchmai, or Gwalchmai, the meaning of which is Hawk of May. Gawain itself is a derivative of Gwalch Gwyn, White Hawk, and Galahad is derived from Welsh Gwalch Haved, meaning Summer Hawk. The name of Peredur, whom we have seen to be the Welsh counterpart of Perceval, comes from the Welsh par, meaning spear, and is sometimes written Palader here. Lancelot's name is derived from the lance which he carried, and Lot or Lud is the British equivalent of the Irish and Welsh gods of light, Lug and Lu. For the meaning of these names, see Studies in the Arthurian Legend by John Rees and Zeus by A.B. Cook, Volume 1, page 243. We can now make a list of the names of the Grail heroes as follows: Gawain, Gwalchmai, Hawk of May, son of the god of light, Lot; Lancelot, the spear of Lot, god of light; Perceval, or Peredur, he of the spear; Galahad, Gwalch Haved, the summer hawk, son of the spear of light. From this, it might seem that we are on the track of a Celtic origin for our Grail legends. But if we are to succeed in showing that the Grail and Cauldron are identical, we must be able to explain the four major points which the legends have in common. 1. The vessel was an inexhaustible source of something precious. 2. Its association with a spear. 3. Its association with a hawk-like hero. 4. And finally its association with a sword. Is there any myth which can provide a clue to associating these 4 points? Indeed there is, and moreover some artist who lived in Egypt more than 2,000 years ago has kindly provided us with an illustration, which is reproduced here. See Figure 1. It is drawn from the rectangular zodiac carving upon the ceiling of the great temple at Dendera, and shows the first ray of the risen sun, who in Egyptian symbolism is always portrayed with a man's body but with the head of a hawk, extinguishing the polar stars of Draconis, known in Egypt as the hippo goddess, and of the plough. What is very significant is the fact that the spear, or sunbeam, of the hawk-headed Ra is pointed directly at the group of stars which we today call the plow, but which the Egyptians called the thigh, or sometimes the haunch of the bull. And this may prove to be the origin of the story of the wounded thigh, which is so entangled with all Grail legends. The illustration of the carving at Dendera will be found in Professor Maspero's Dawn of Civilization, page 94, where the names of the groups of stars are given. See also The Dawn of Astronomy by J. Norman Lockyer. Figure 1, the stars of the plow figured as the haunch of a bull, being extinguished by the ray of the hawk-headed sun god Ra, from the great temple of Dendera, after Professor Maspero's illustration in The Dawn of Civilization. To those who have read Professor W. J. Perry's Growth of Civilization and other similar works, it will be no surprise to find that the culture of Egypt spread to our shores. But for the casual reader, it is necessary to show that this was possible and indeed probable. The picture of ancient Britain, which is obtained from our elementary school books, is generally a false one, for it is often made to appear that the Romans, when they first landed here, found a homogeneous race of aboriginal savages who painted themselves with woad. Any full history of ancient Britain and its archaeology, written within the last 50 years, will, on the contrary, give a very different picture. Archaeological discoveries have enabled historians to put very rough dates to the various folk from the continent who invaded and settled in our land, and are distinguished by their different potteries and culture. Very broadly speaking, every 300 or 400 years a new wave of strangers would assail our shores, from as far back as 1500 BC, until the coming of the Celts of the Latène culture in about 500 BC, followed by the Belgae, who arrived just before Caesar's time. The general opinion of modern students is that the great stones which were raised, such as the circle at Stonehenge, were erected by a people coming from the neighborhood of the Aegean, or at any rate closely in touch with that seafaring civilization of which Crete was the center. That these stone circles were taken over and used by the Druids at a much later date is almost certain, but it is equally certain that the stones were in place long before the Celts ever reached Britain. Beads of ceramic similar to those found in Egypt have been discovered in some of the earliest burial mounds, and there are archaeologists who see certain similarities between the long barrows and the Egyptian tomb chambers. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his 12th century History of Britain, recorded the tradition that the first kings of Britain were descended from the royal race of Troy through Brutus, a great-grandson of Aeneas, and that this Brutus gave his name to our island. I know it is the modern fashion to decry Geoffrey's history and to write off his whole work as a mere flight of the imagination. No doubt he did embellish and to a large extent invent, but those who have ever attempted to create a really original work of fiction will know how difficult it is to produce an entirely new story without building on some previously existing strata of ideas. The character of Brutus may be Geoffrey's invention, but behind it there may very likely lie a folk memory of traders from the Aegean and Troy, and when archaeological discoveries tend to confirm this, it would surely be a biased opinion that refused to consider Geoffrey's claim. Pliny, discussing magic, asserts that the Britons were so accomplished in the art, and their practice of it so similar to that of the Persian Magi, that he suggests a British origin for the Persian cult. Pliny in Natural History 34. The fact that the Phoenicians came to Cornwall for tin is known to all. They probably first arrived in the 9th century BC, at a time when Tyre had succeeded to Crete's place as mistress of the sea, and only 2 or 3 centuries after the Phoenician cities had freed themselves from the domination of Egyptian imperialism, but not from the worship of Egypt's gods. It is interesting here to reflect that Toledo in Spain was at first a Punic settlement, and that it was in Toledo that Wolfram von Eschenbach claimed that the true story of Parzival and the Grail had been found. I give his words as translated by Miss Weston. For Kiot of old, the master whom men spoke of in days of yore, far off in Toledo's city, found in Arabic writ the lore, by men cast aside and forgotten, the tale of the wondrous Grail. But first must he learn the letters, nor black art might there avail. By the grace of baptismal waters, by the light of our holy faith, he read the tale, else 'twere hidden, for never the story saith. Might heathen skill have shown us the virtue that hidden lies in this mighty Grail, or its marvel have opened to Christian eyes. 'Twas a heathen, Phlegetonis, who had won for his wisdom fame, and saw many a wondrous vision, from Israel's race he came. In the blood of the kings of old time, of Solomon did he share. He wrote in the days long vanished, ere we as a shield might bear the cross of our holy baptism, 'gainst the craft and wiles of hell, and he was the first of earth's children, the lore of the Grail to tell. By his father's side a heathen, a calf he for God did hold. How wrought the devil such folly on a folk so wise of old? And the heathen, Phlegetonis, could read in the heavens high, how the stars roll on their courses, how they circle the silent sky. And the time when their wandering endeth, and the life and the lot of men, he read in the stars, and strange secrets he saw, and he spake again. Lo, with bated breath, and fearful of the thing that is called the Grail, in a cluster of stars was it written, the name, nor their lore shall fail. From this we see that a Jew whose fathers worshipped the golden calf of Egypt is here associated with a knowledge of the Grail. To return then to Egypt and its connection with our shores, the Tuatha De Danann, the mythical folk who invaded Ireland and brought with them the Cauldron of the Dagda, are believed by most students of Irish history to be not a people but of are believed by most students of Irish history to be not a people, but the gods of a people called the Milesians, who invaded Ireland in remote times. According to the Irish Book of Conquests, Miled, the king of this Milesian folk, brought with him his wife Scotta, who was a daughter of Pharaoh, and from whom the Scots, her descendants, took their name. The Book of Leinster and the 11th century Acts of St. Cadreau both mention the legend, but give Scotta another Milesian husband called Nell or Nellis. For these accounts of Scotta, see Celtic Scotland by W. F. Skene. There were well-known trade routes by which the culture of the Near East could reach Britain. One came from Asia Minor up the valley of the Danube, crossed over to the Elbe, and made contact with the shore of the Baltic, where amber could be obtained. Any culture which came to the north by this route was influenced by the civilizations of the Euphrates and Tigris valleys and of Troy. The other route was by sea, through the Pillars of Hercules and round the coast of Spain, or alternatively by sea as far as the Greek settlements of Marseilles, and then overland to Brittany. By this route came the culture of Egypt, the Aegean and Phoenician cities, and finally of Greece and Rome. In Greece, the spear-bearing Ra becomes Apollo with his dart. In Rome, Romulus, whom we shall presently see as a child of the sun, becomes metamorphosed after death into Quirinus, meaning the spear holder, and is worshipped on the hill of the Quirinal. For the story of the metamorphosis of Romulus, see Ovid, Fasti 2, 475. In Britain, a special hill, or tor, is dedicated to the spear and its accompanying hawk or eagle. In Geoffrey of Monmouth, attempts to put a date to the arrival of this magic eagle by making it contemporary with Solomon's building of the Jewish temple in the 10th century BC. I quote from the Welsh version of his history, and this Ron, a king of Britain, or Ravon, built Caer Caint and Caer Wint, and Caer Vid e Paladir, the Caer of the mountain of the spear. And there the eagle prophesied, foreboding evil to this island. And Salif, or Solomon, son of David, finished Jerusalem. The legendary king of Lot of the Lothians is generally conceded to have been originally the Celtic god of light. He was married to Anna, and she is none other than Anath, the great mother of the Phoenicians. At Ephesus in Greek, she is known as Diana, the goddess Anna. In Ireland, she is Donna or Dana. In Wales, many royal or saintly genealogies are preserved which go back to a certain Avaloch, who was the son of Beli, who in turn was the son of Anna, the first ancestress. We shall presently see who those heroes, Beli and Avaloch, were, and that the latter is identical with the Evelach of Grail legend. I hope that I have now given sufficient evidence to show that it is very possible that some contact was at one time made between the civilization of the Aegean in these islands, whereby the cult of the hawk-headed sun god with a spear could have become known. But the purpose of our inquiry is to find the real meaning of the Grail. If the spear of Grail legend was indeed the ray of the sun god, into what vessel could this seemingly divine effluence flow? The answer is supplied by many classical references. It is a vessel or any other medium whereby the sun's rays can be focused to a point so as to light a fire. The fire was considered sacred because it was a manifestation of the sun god's point of arrival or incarnation upon earth. The following Homeric hymn illustrates why such fire was held to be holy. Then from the ship sprang the far-darting Apollo, like a star in the middle day, and there flew. Sparks from him in myriads, their brightness ascending to the heavens. He entered the shrine where stand the glorious tripods, and lit the fire therein, making visible his bolts. If then we are to learn more about the vessel through which fire descended, we must turn to the accounts of sacred and so-called perpetual fires. The majority of such accounts are contained in works of the 1st century AD, and I realize that such writings are comparatively late. Scholars might argue that the conquests of Alexander and the Roman Empire had resulted in such a general mix-up of cults that it is impossible to accept assertions that such and such a faith was peculiar to a particular country at that time. I would answer to this that, first, there is a great difference between what people believe and what they do. Philosophies and theogonies change with time, but ritual practice exists long after the original purpose of it has been forgotten. As an example, the Beltane fires were lit by Christians in Scotland to the very end of the 19th century. While, therefore, we can sometimes mistrust a 1st century writer when he is explaining what a particular people believed, we need not doubt his veracity when he describes what ritual they practiced. Secondly, if I can show that this custom of using a grail to light a sacred fire was common to most races long before the time of Alexander, then the fusion of cults which took place from his time onward need not concern us, and we shall be left only with the difficult question of when and where such a ritual originated. There was a sacred fire at Delphi and another at Athens, and Plutarch in his Life of Numa tells us how these were lit from the sun's rays. Whenever in Greece a perpetual fire is kept, as at Delphi and Athens, it is committed to the charge not of virgins, but of widows past the age of marriage. And if by any chance it goes out, as at Athens during the tyranny of Aristion, the sacred lamp is said to have been extinguished, and at Delphi when the temple was burned by the Medes, and as during the Mithridatic in the Roman civil wars, the altar was demolished and the fire extinguished, then they say it must not be kindled from other fire, but made fresh and new by lighting a pure and unpolluted flame from the rays of the sun. And this they usually effect by means of metallic mirrors, the concavity of which is made to follow the sides of an isosceles rectangular triangle, and which converge from their circumference to a single point in the center. When, therefore, these are placed opposite the sun, so that its rays, as they fall upon them from all sides, are collected and concentrated at the center, the air itself is rarefied there, the very light and dry substances placed there quickly blaze up from its resistance, the sun's rays now acquiring the substance and force of fire. While it is difficult to follow Plutarch's mathematical explanation of the angles at which the light is reflected, we have only to look at the concave reflector of a modern arc lamp or small electric radiator to know what shape the metal bowl must have been. Apuleius, in his Apologia, also refers to the phenomenon and asks, why do concave mirrors, when held at right angles to the rays of the sun, kindle tinder set opposite them? Anthemius, a Greek mathematician at the court of the Emperor Justin, was one of the first to attempt a scientific study of the behavior of light. Only fragments of his work have come down to us, but in one of his experiments he mentions a mirror in the shape of an oven. Here is our link with the word cauldron, for cooking utensils in ancient times were not so carefully differentiated as they are today. Any metal receptacle which would hold food or water was put to use by the common folk to boil or to bake, and to serve alternately as cauldron or oven upon an open hearth, in much the same way as the Scots wife still bakes her scones upon an open girdle. A concave bowl of reflective metal could as easily be termed an oven as a cauldron, though it was too precious. We are told its rim was set with pearls, ever to be used on the hearth. Its purpose was to ignite the flame. We come now to another means whereby men could bring down the fire from heaven. The following will be found in the Orphic Book of Stones. Take in your hands a crystal, a glittering transparent stone, a ray of clear divine brightness. In heaven it particularly delights the heart of the immortal gods, and if you go to a shrine carrying one in your hands, none of the gods will refuse your requests. Listen then, that you may learn the powers of this gleaming stone. If you wish to stir up flames without living fire, you order the stone to be laid on top of dry firebrands. Then, when the sun is shining from the opposite direction, it will immediately unfold above the brands a thin ray. As soon as this touches the dry, thick material, it will give rise to smoke, then slight fire, and finally a great flame. This the ancient goddesses called the sacred fire. Therefore I trust that haunches, so pleasing to the immortals, burn with no other flame. In addition, I shall tell you as a friend this great miracle. As soon as you lift from the fire that very crystal, which is the cause of the flame, it is cold to the touch, and if placed on the kidneys, will relieve pain. The crystal described here was probably a sphere for the following reasons. In the case of a crystal ball, the focal point would lie just within the surface of the sphere, but the emergent beam would still be strong enough to ignite dry timber in contact with the surface. We shall presently see that in the case of a crystal lens or a hollow glass sphere filled with water, the focal point lies outside the surface and would therefore need to be held or fixed above or away from the tinder. We shall meet in further references the astonishment of the ancients that a stone which could cause fire should itself remain cold and unconsumed. It is also interesting to observe that here the crystal is credited with curative powers. That this was no empty superstition is shown by Pliny, who first records a sun treatment as follows. I find it stated by a medical man that the very best cautery for the human body is a ball of crystal, acted upon by the rays of the sun. Pliny in Natural History 37:10. Furthermore, he asserts that rock crystal is a form of ice which has been more or less permanently solidified. Crystal is only to be found in places where the winter snow freezes with the greatest intensity, and it is from the certainty that it is a kind of ice that it has received the name which it bears in Greece. Rainwater and pure snow are absolutely necessary to its formation. Pliny Natural History 37:9. We shall see on the next page the significance of this belief. If such mirrors or crystals were kept in the temples ready to light the sacred fire, their existence and whereabouts, at least in early times, was wrapped in mystery and as closely veiled to all but initiates as well as the Grail itself. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in 7 BC about the temple of Vesta's sacred fire in Rome, says, and Numa enacted in accordance with the ancestral customs of the Latins, that the guarding of the holy things should be committed to virgins. There is some doubt, however, what it is that is kept in the temple, and for what reasons the care of it has been assigned to virgins, some affirming that nothing is preserved there but the fire, which is visible to everybody. He goes on to say, they regard the fire as consecrated to Vesta, because that goddess, being the earth and occupying the central place in the universe, kindles the celestial fires from herself. But there are some who say that besides the fire, there are some holy things in the temple of the goddess that may not be revealed to the public, of which only the pontiffs and the virgins have knowledge. Continuing, he explains that a strong confirmation of this story is the fact that when the temple caught fire during the First Punic War, a certain Roman called Metellus dared the flames in order to rescue the holy things. He proceeds. Some affirm that the objects preserved here are part of those holy things which were once in Samothrace, that Dardanus removed them out of that island into the city which he himself had built, and that Aeneas, when he fled from the Troad, brought them along with other holy things into Italy. But others declare that it is the Palladium that fell from heaven, the same that was in the possession of the people of Ilium, for they hold that Aeneas, being well acquainted with it, brought it into Italy, whereas the Achaeans stole away the copy. He concludes, for my part, I find from very many evidences that there are indeed some holy things, unknown to the public, kept by the virgins, and not the fire alone. See the Roman Antiquities, Book 2, 66 and 67. It has so far been shown that a concave mirror dedicated to the use of the sun god could pass for the pearl-rimmed cauldron of Celtic myth. It is, to all purposes, an inexhaustible vessel, for the sun as a source of energy certainly appears inexhaustible, and the shining silver vessel can produce fire indefinitely. Is it possible, then, that either a mirror or a crystal could be the Grail? The answer, I think, is that both sacra were displayed to the initiates of the Grail cult. Le Saint Teliors d'Argent is the silver bowl-shaped mirror, and Wolfram, while denying indignantly the truth of Chrétien's version of the story, expressly tells us that the Grail was a stone. He is referring to the chivalrous company of the guardians of the talisman, and he says, "And this brotherhood so gallant, doest thou know what to them shall give their life and their strength and their valor, then know by a stone they live, and that stone is both pure and precious. Its name hast thou never heard? Men call it lapis axilis. By its magic the wondrous bird, the phoenix, becometh ashes, and yet doth such virtue flow from the stone, that afresh it riseth renewed from the ashes glow. And the plumes that erewhile it moulted spring forth yet more fair and bright." Then after a few more verses, Wolfram declares, "And this stone all men call the Grail." We shall deal fully with the phoenix in a later chapter, but for the present this symbolism needs no further explanation, for it is surely well known to all that the phoenix is the symbol of fire and its renewal. Wolfram is therefore telling us that the Grail stone was a stone which produced fire. We can leave until later the question of the meaning of lapis lazuli, which has so far puzzled all commentators, and also the question of why a crystal lens should be connected with the idea of bread from heaven, which will be explained in a later chapter. Let us now go on to Wolfram's description of how once a year the wound of the lame king, Amfortas, becomes more than usually painful, and how the spear, which we have shown to be the sun's rays, is then plunged into the wound to give some small measure of relief. If we compare the following passage with Pliny's description of cauterizing a poisoned wound by means of a crystal ball, which was believed to be ice, there can be no little doubt that, at any rate as far as Wolfram's version of the legend is concerned, the talisman was a crystal, and that a Jew, Phlegetonus, had recorded not only its ability to inspire men with mystical ideas about God, but its purely physical powers to effect certain cures. Here are Wolfram's words: "As ever the time draws near, when Saturn his journey endeth, that time by the wound or wound we know, and yet by another token by the fall of the summer snow. Then sorely the frost doth pain him, thy king and uncle dear, and deep in the wound empoisoned once more do they plunge the spear. One woe shall help the other, the spear cure the frost's sharp pain." After a few verses, Wolfram goes on: "In the time that erst I have told thee, then the king little rest may gain. His flesh through the frost it groweth colder than e'en the snow. But men know that the spear sharp pointed doth with fiery venom glow, and upon the wound they lay it, and the frost from his flesh so cold, it draweth, and lo, as crystals of glass to the spear doth hold, and as ice to the iron it clingeth, and none looseth it from the blade. So far I have endeavored to trace the identity of the sacred vessel, but for now we must return to our four main points. It has been shown that a crystal or mirror is an inexhaustible source of fire, and that it is associated with the hawk-headed sun god and his spear of light. But we have not identified the magic sword. Miss Weston guessed that it was a sun sword, but this term has in the past been used very loosely to describe what was thought to be the mythical weapon of a solar hero. In fact, the sword of the Grail was as much a material object and had as useful a purpose as the Grail itself. But in order to know what it was, it is necessary first to understand the reason of man's original veneration for the sacred flame, the fire from heaven, and this will be reserved for the next chapter. Alright, this is a study of two worlds, Persephone, Part 1, Miss Blandish in the Underworld. Chapter 1, Persephone. No Orchids for Miss Blandish was one of the most successful books of its decade. Not only were several million copies of the book itself sold, but a film was made of the story, and Miss Blandish's name became literally a household word, which could be used on the stage or even in BBC programs, in the assurance that it would be familiar to the widest circles of the public. Miss Blandish, in fact, became one of the great legendary figures which inhabit the communal mind. She belongs almost to the company of Sherlock Holmes, Tarzan, Alice, and Peter Pan. It is clear that a phenomenon of this magnitude can be attributed to one cause only. The figure in question must correspond to something which is universally present in the minds of contemporary people. It must constitute something which they want to talk about, which fits into their views and feelings about life, which helps them to express themselves and thus to come to terms with the problems of existence. Miss Blandish is a typical mythological figure, a portrayal, that is to say, of a symbolical destiny expressed in terms of human life. Images of this nature are universal in humanity, and are to be found in the myths and legends of all peoples at all times. There is no essential difference at all between the story of Miss Blandish's descent into the Underworld and that of Persephone, evolved over 2,000 years ago and still familiar to us. Such a conclusion is not immediately acceptable. Persephone seems so remote, and we learnt about her at school, which puts her story into a moralizing, instructional category that seems infinitely far removed from the unedifying tale of Miss Blandish. And we have tidied away the old myth by explaining it. Persephone, we say, represents the vegetation which disappears in the winter and returns in the spring. And with that superficial rationalization, we believe that we have accounted for her. We shall return later to this question of explaining away myths. At present, it will suffice to point out that this particular explanation is completely inadequate. Demeter, the mother, represents vegetation, and she remains forlorn above the earth. Why was it necessary to invent the additional figure of a virgin daughter? And what has the latter's rape to do with the vegetation theme? Where does Pluto come into it? The Greeks were quite aware of the parallel between Persephone's periodical disappearance and return and the cycle of vegetation, but many of them saw far more in the story than that, for it constituted the basic theme of the mysteries of Eleusis, which were perhaps the most important of all manifestations of the mystical element in classical religion. It is evident that for the ancient world, the Persephone myth must have played a part similar to that which the story of the crucifixion and resurrection has played in the Christian world. It represented in symbolical form certain basic spiritual facts with which every human being is concerned. For the wide popularity and the profound and beneficent spiritual effects of the mysteries on those who participated in them are attested by a number of reputable contemporary authorities. They were available to all who spoke Greek and bore no blood guilt, and the resultant diversity of personalities among the participants, from the simplest to the most cultured and intellectual, would hardly all have been so moved and inspired by a superficial allegory of such an obvious nature as that of the vegetation cycle. The disreputable story of no orchids would seem at first sight to stand in crass contrast to such sacred themes. It is characterized by a daring treatment of sex and violence, and any comparison between such sadistic lewdness and the themes of classical legend, even though they no longer form part of our religious beliefs, is repugnant to our finer feelings. But so is the story of Persephone a tale of sex and violence. Not only the daughter, but the mother also is raped by Poseidon. See Jung and Karenyi, Einführung in die Wesen die Mythologie. The atmosphere of anxious propriety of the schoolroom and of the school books from which we learn the story is apt to obliterate this fact. There is no reason why spiritual truths should not be expressed in terms of sex and violence. It may not be desirable, but the fact remains that it often happens. The people who evolved the myth of Persephone and the secret revelations of the Eleusinian mysteries were not compiling moralizing tales for school children any more than Hadley Chase was when he wrote No Orchids. They and he had become dimly and introspectively aware of a tragic symbolical destiny which demanded expression, and each of them set about bringing it to expression in the contemporary idiom. It is our task as investigators to look behind the idiom, to think away the gangsters and millionaires and nightclubs of No Orchids, just as we think away the personified divine principles of the ancient myth in an effort to discover what the stories really mean. All that matters is what happened, not what the respective authors suggest to account for why it happened. Until we have examined the material of No Orchids in greater detail, we cannot go further into its possible parallels with the Persephone legend. I have introduced the matter here at the outset in order to give some indication of the kind of material for which we may be on the lookout. My thesis is that Miss Blandish's enormous popularity can only be accounted for by elements in her story which have some significance apart from the mere superficial handling of it. It would be foolish to deny that much of the popular appeal of the book did lie in the lewd and gruesome episodes in which it abounds. Sex and horrors have always been popular themes, and today the purveying of such matter has become a prosperous industry. Yet no figure from the horror fiction, or indeed from any fiction, of her decade found anything like the same universal acceptance as Miss Blandish. No Orchids remains a classic, still to be found on the shelves of respectable libraries, and although its popularity has now faded, it can confidently be predicted that in due course it will revive. Thus, although it is true to say that if the story had been written in a less sensational form, it would not have reached quite such a wide public, it is no less true that if it had contained no more than sensationalism, it would never have been remembered. As G.F. Orwell said in an article devoted to it, No Orchids is a brilliant piece of writing, yet the wide public, among whom it had found acceptance, are not unduly critical in such matters. They are concerned with the substance rather than the style, and subsequent works by the same author, in which seductions and horrors are no less brilliantly described, have made little impression. The significance of No Orchids lies in the story, and the story exercised its fascination on the intellectual critic and writer Orwell no less than on the great unenlightened public. It must contain something of universal significance. Before turning to the work itself, it is necessary to dispose of one important point, namely the dependence of No Orchids on another work, William Faulkner's Sanctuary. I am indebted to Dr. H.L.R. Edwards for drawing my attention to this point, and also to No Orchids itself. In the following chapters we shall find numerous examples of such derivations of one work from another. There is no question of plagiarism, it is rather a matter of inspiration. The function of the writer of fiction is to discern the essential and significant elements in human situations and to present them in the form of a coherent and acceptable story. It is immaterial from what source his materials are derived. They may come from actual events in the outer world, from his own unaided fantasy, or from the works of other writers. All that matters is his ability to present them in the most telling form. We can speak of plagiarism only when a writer, at a loss for ideas, deliberately sets out to remodel an existing work, which has proved successful, in a disguise in which he hopes it will not be recognized. The dividing line between such a servile imitation and the case in which existing literary material has acted as a source of inspiration and a spur to emulation is hard to define. Yet, in its results, it is obvious enough. It is well known, for instance, that a great many of Shakespeare's plots were derived from existing legends and tales. Yet no reasonable person would accuse Shakespeare of plagiarism on that account. What happened was, evidently, that Shakespeare, reading the stories in question, discerned their underlying meaning or pattern, and that he was impelled to produce his own fresh rendering of it. The situation is similar to my own experience related in the introduction to this inquiry. It is a case of two individual minds interpreting the same universal experience, and it can take place even when the two minds in question have no external knowledge of one another's productions. More commonly, perhaps, one of the interpretations is the immediate consequence of its authors having read the other, but that is immaterial. Shakespeare read a crude medieval legend concerning dynastic conflicts at the court of Denmark, and discerned in it the bare bones of a situation which he presented in the complex psychological form of Hamlet. That presentation is his own rendering of a universal mental pattern, which necessarily existed in a potential state in his mind even before he had read the ancient epic of the troubles at Elsinore. And it is, therefore, only a matter of secondary importance to discover exactly what item in his reading turned his attention to it. This matter of the interaction of the personal or particular in the universal parts of the mind is one of the principal themes of this study, and will be further elucidated in later chapters. At this point, we may introduce the subject by a brief outline of Jung's theory of the archetypes. The archetypes. When a fresh human life is inaugurated by the impregnation of an ovum, the resultant zygote, or elementary embryo, is a single cell which differs in hardly any external particular from that from which a dog or a horse or even a sea urchin will develop. Nevertheless, we can say with certainty that if this entity survives for a few months, it will have attained a recognizable human form. In the vast majority of cases, it will then grow into a man or woman between 5 and 6 feet in height, and almost invariably it will possess 2 eyes, a nose, 2 hands, and so forth. Individual variations between certain limits are normal, and exceptional conditions during childhood and gestation may produce striking abnormalities. Nevertheless, we can be absolutely confident that this microscopic creature will in no circumstances grow to a height of 20 feet, nor will it develop feathers or a carapace, or even a digestive system capable of breaking down cellulose as a cow's can. These characteristics do not belong to the human pattern, which is already present, in a potential state, even in the single cell of the fertilized ovum. The adult human being who will eventuate after about 20 years, therefore, may be seen as the product of the interaction of 2 factors. On the one hand, the unvarying and universal pattern of the species, and on the other, the particular factors affecting the individual being. The latter are partly endogenous, arising from the particular combination of genes in the original zygote, and partly extragenous, deriving from the particular conditions to which the individual organism has been subjected during its development. The endogenous elements are on the borderline and may be included among either the universal racial components or the individual ones, according to how closely we circumscribe the hereditary factor. But the elements arising from influences which take effect after conception are clearly a part of the individual existence as distinct from the general pattern of the race or stock. The color of the eyes, for instance, may be solely determined by the parental stock, but the effects of disease or abnormal nutrition during gestation or childhood are purely individual. The typical characteristics of the species, however, are not confined to physical forms. They embrace typical mental tendencies or behavior patterns as well. Tortoises are not only equipped with a carapace, but with the impulse to draw the head and limbs into its protection when alarmed. Nightingales sing, spiders spin webs, and human beings pick things up with their hands and investigate them. We can therefore be confident that the human embryo will develop not only a recognizable human form, but that, gross abnormalities apart, it will come into possession of a complete and stereotyped set of human behavior tendencies as well. Not only the body, but the mind also has a typical, unvarying, universal, generic substructure. This is the universal mind in which we all participate, just as we participate in the basic anatomical structure of the species, or of our species. We shall be concerned later with the specific manner in which this universal human mind acts through the mechanism of the instinctive reactions and the intermediate levels of the unconscious mind. It will be sufficient for the moment to draw attention to its contrast with the individual element in the mind. In humanity, the potentiality of individual variation in the mental sphere infinitely exceeds what is possible in the physical. It is in this respect that we have so far differentiated ourselves from the rest of our animal creation as to justify the conception of an entirely separate plane of human existence. It is the faculty of adding to our generic mental heritage by means of learning from individual experience, which we have brought to such an extraordinary pitch that each human individual has come to regard himself as a closed, self-contained personal mind, entirely cut off from his generic mental roots. In our concentration on the particular, we have lost sight of the universal. Nevertheless, the development of each individual mind remains confined within the pattern of generic potentialities, exactly as that of the body does. The potentialities of individual variation within the universal pattern are infinitely greater in the mental than in the physical sphere. In the swimming bath, there is little difference between one man and another. One has blue eyes and the other brown. One is taller by perhaps a fifth of his total stature than the others. But they go home and one sits down to write a treatise on mathematics and the other to mend shoes. One resumes the responsibilities of empire and the other returns to picking pockets. Yet the philosopher and the statesman can no more evade or transcend the typical patterns of the human mind than the cobbler and the pickpocket can. Their minds, like their bodies, are formed in the same generic mold and have been built up on the same generic foundations by the action of the same generic impulses. The only difference between them lie in their particular manner in which they, or their individual mental experiences and peculiarities, have interacted and combined within this framework to produce that complex of mental habits, skills, standards of value, and guiding ideas which we call the personality. The difference between one human personality and another may be truly immense and fraught with immense consequences. Nevertheless, it cannot transcend the limits of the essentially human. Similarly, in the physical sphere, two men may have utilized their identical basic human endowment differently, in that one has learnt to swim while the other is not. This constitutes an individual difference in capacity which in certain circumstances may be of vital importance, and that one will survive where the other drowns. But the very importance of this difference lies precisely in the fact that both are subject to the same basic and unalterable limitation, namely that they cannot survive underwater. One of them has taken account of the universal human limitation and has adapted the universal human potentialities to it in learning to keep his head above water when out of his depth. The other, having failed in this, must pay the penalty. But if the swimmer, failing to understand the nature of the problem, had attempted to overcome the generic human inability to live underwater simply by keeping his head underwater for as long as he could, with the intention of eventually training himself to remain there indefinitely, he would never have learnt to swim and would have drowned as surely as the other who had never concerned himself with the problem. He would have failed to understand and thus to circumvent the inherent limitations of his human constitution. In the sphere of the mind, it is exactly the same. The highest individual attainments of which we are capable are achieved by adapting human potentialities to human limitations, and the inability to understand or the failure to accept the latter must lead to disaster. In the course of this study, we shall find numerous examples of this tragic fact. The mind has learnt to recognize the limitations of the body, but it is harder for it to appreciate its own. Possibilities which transcend or differ from the factors by which the conscious mind is molded or on which it has been built up, simply do not exist for it possesses no means of apprehending them. Since, therefore, there is nothing with which it can compare its own nature, it cannot recognize that nature in its entirety. Perceiving some of the things which it can do, it is apt to assume that it is potentially capable of doing anything, and it is forever embarking on enterprises which ignore the limitations of which it is not aware. The majority of human disasters, as we shall see, can be attributed to this tendency, yet, on the other hand, the same tendency is the mainspring of human achievement. For it is precisely by the initiative which impels us to attempt what has never been attempted that we have grown great. It is, therefore, vitally necessary that we should learn to form as clear a picture as possible of the nature of our innate impulses and insurmountable limitations, no less than of our potentialities. If the mind were not equipped with some mechanism which warned it to desist when it was attempting the mentally impossible, the human race could not have survived. This mechanism acts by presenting to the conscious mind images in the form of visions, inner voices, dreams, emotions, or simply ideas, which in some way run counter to or contrast with the conscious attitude. They derive from a primitive level of the mind which disposes only of an archaic symbolical language which differs from that of the highly developed educated conscious mind and is not immediately comprehensible to the latter. If the conscious mind fails to understand these messages, it may persist in some enterprise or attitude which ignores the inherent limitations of the mind in the same way as an attempt to live under water ignores those of the body. In such a case, mental sickness will result. The conscious mind, on the other hand, may learn to accept these warnings and to interpret them correctly, in which case the error of its ways will be revealed to it, and it will be in a position to amend them. Modern psychology seeks to teach the conscious mind to interpret these messages. Freud recognized their symbolical nature, but related them exclusively to outer world situations. They represent, in his system, merely disguised wish fulfillments, which the conscious mind refuses to entertain in their true form, because of their unacceptability by conventional moral standards, or for other similar reasons. Jung, on the other hand, sees in them something far more fundamental. They are expressions or intimations of the basic structure of the mind itself, not merely allegorical representations of concrete situations. Such allegorical representations, he admits, do occur when the unconscious mind is simply rectifying some oversight or ill-considered judgment of the conscious mind. He quotes the example of a patient whose mental capacity he had underrated, and whose figure thereupon appeared to him in a dream standing above him on a high tower. Interpreting this dream as the resurgence from his unconscious mind of impressions of the superior qualities of the patient to which he had paid insufficient conscious attention, and which had therefore been repressed by the attitude suitable to a mentally inferior person which he had adopted towards her, he informed her frankly of his mistake and amended his attitude, naturally, as he says, with the best results. But behind and beyond such more or less trivial intimations of minor errors which anybody, if he takes the trouble, can identify in his day-to-day dreams and fantasies, Jung discerned a body of more generalized or abstract symbols of far wider import. As might be expected, such figures occurred with peculiar persistence in the dreams, fantasies, and delusions of the mentally sick, but they corresponded in an inexplicable way with the figures of myth and legend, from the most ancient fables to contemporary poetry and fiction. Dissatisfied with Freud's contention that these parallels, some of which he had himself discerned, simply indicated the prevalence in all individual minds at all times of repressed concrete wishes, mostly of an incestuous nature. Jung advanced the hypothesis that they should rather be regarded as revelations by the mind of its own generic structure. This structure being the mold in which the individual conscious mind is formed, the foundation on which it has been built up, and the impulses by which it was built, in which are active in it. It is normally inaccessible to consciousness. For so long as the conscious mind confines itself to its legitimate activities, indeed, there is no need for it to have any knowledge of its own background. It is only when its natural spirit of enterprise entices it into undertakings which do violence to the inherent limitations of the mind as a whole that it stands in need of restraint. When this happens, the offended part or structure of the universal mind calls attention to itself in exactly the same way as, for instance, the digestive system, normally unconscious, calls attention to itself if we persist in eating unsuitable food. The mind, like the body, must be regarded as a whole, all of whose parts and functions interact and depend on one another. Like the body, moreover, it has certain specific modes of reaction to specific stimuli or provocations, just as the body reacts with a raising of the temperature, a lowering of the blood pressure, inflammations, discharges, and the like. So does the mind react with certain definite emotional states, impulses, obsessions, and so forth. These mental reactions may be identified and described exactly like physical symptoms, and for convenience may be treated as separate entities, just as a fever or an inflammation may be so treated. Roughly speaking, it may be said that these specific modes of reaction of the universal mental disposition, or structure of humanity, are the manifestations of what Jung has called the archetypes. They may be recognized in their universal occurrence, just as specific physical symptoms may be recognized. And valid conclusions may be drawn from their presence. Nevertheless, it may be remembered that they are modes of reaction of the unitary mind, of which they are parts, and not strictly circumscribed entities existing in their own right. Similarly, the wise doctor will always bear in mind that it is not the fever which he has to cure, but the patient's whole organism, which is producing the fever as a reaction to some unsatisfactory condition. I say the patient's organism, and not the patient himself advisedly, for in mental sickness it is the universal part of the mind affected by the patient's faulty conscious attitude which has to be considered, not merely his individual personality. In a sense, the patient himself is the disease. An important characteristic of the archetypes is that they habitually present themselves to the conscious mind in the form of images which tend to behave in a certain way. These images are often visual, although they may take other forms as well, and consist of human figures, animals, objects, and scenes, and in situations in which some or all of these occur in relation to one another. Typical examples are a wise old man, a woman of supernatural beauty and power, a sword which breaks and must be mended, the birth of a divine child, imprisonment, the menace of an armed man appearing from the darkness, the sun at its rising, setting, and zenith. These may be described as typical archetypal figures or images. They are not, of course, the archetypes themselves, any more than the body of a man or his activities are the man himself, but they are living realities, no less than the body and actions of the man are realities. They possess power and exert their influence on the mind, no less than the man's body and actions exert their influence on the outer world. I have described the archetypes as warning symbols and modes of reaction similar to the symptoms of physical sickness, but they must not be regarded as exclusively pathological phenomena. The mind, like the body, has its requirements when in normal health, and will draw attention to them when they are in need of satisfaction. Like the body, it demands alternations of exercise and rest, nourishment from external sources, and evacuation of its own waste products, a routine complying with its inherent rhythms as a rule, varied by occasional stimulating irregularities. In addition to these parallels with physical existence, it has its own typical modes of activity and quiescence, evolution, involution, dichotomy, reunification, and self-renewal. All of these are represented by archetypal images and situations. The processes themselves, or the hypothetical structures of the mind, by and through which they take place, may be regarded as the actual essence of the archetypes, although with the proviso that we cannot, in the last resort, define what anything mental is. A fortiori, to brush the question aside with the claim that mental phenomena are no more than disguised representations of concrete outer world situations, is merely puerile, for the situation of the outer world possess the character of situations solely by virtue of the attitude of the mind. The mind, like the body, maintains its individual existence by virtue of a complex system of equilibria between counterbalancing forces. In the last resort, such a particular pattern of equilibrium between non-individualized elements is the nearest notion we can form of the essence of living individuality. If this equilibrium is endangered, the survival of the individuality is threatened, and the activity of the ultimate center of the individual is always directed to restoring it. The means which it brings into action for the purpose are the archetypal modes which are revealed to consciousness in the form of archetypal images. When they are thus revealed, it may be assumed that they are active. They are living forces, tending purposefully in a given direction, governed by the inherent laws of their natures, which in turn are part of the inherent structure of the psyche or universal mind of man. The appearance of archetypal images in consciousness, therefore, although not necessarily an indication of a pathological or morbid condition of the mind, does indicate that equilibrium is endangered and that measures are being taken to restore it. They are themselves the expression of healthy reaction to the disturbing influences. These disturbing influences, moreover, must themselves be the consequences of the activity of one of the archetypal modes, since the mind is not capable of functioning in any other manner. The disturbance indicates that one or other of the modes has temporarily achieved an undue preponderance and requires to be checked by countervailing tendencies. The equilibrium of the mind, like that of the body in walking, is in a permanent condition of flux and transition, for only thus is progress possible. A state of permanent, static equilibrium would imply stagnation, and life demands change. A rich and vivid experience of archetypal images, therefore, may be a concomitant, or may be a concomitant of intense mental advance. It is characteristic of the spiritually creative, no less than of the mentally sick. As a corollary, we may conclude that the creative process, being associated with a precarious mental equilibrium, is a dangerous one, and of this we shall find ample confirmation. Bearing these points in mind, we may return to our two stories. William Faulkner's Sanctuary was published in 1931, 8 years earlier than No Orchids, and, unlike as the two works are in many respects, the parallels between them are striking. Faulkner, of course, is a writer of far greater literary pretensions and higher status than Chase. He is indeed the holder of a Nobel Prize. Sanctuary, among other things, is a sociological study of the Deep South in the 20s, but this aspect of the work, together with its psychological subtleties, is not our concern here. I mention them merely in order to avoid giving the impression that the two works are comparable from the literary point of view, which they are not. We are concerned here only with a common element in archetypal symbolism, such as is to be found equally in such remote material as the Persephone myth. This element, on which No Orchids is based, constitutes only one thread in the complex plot of Sanctuary. But in addition to the parallels in this theme, and in the portrayal of the characters, attention should be drawn to another characteristic in which the two works correspond. That is, the predominant gray misery of the feeling tone, the insistence on the cruel and the sordid, the atmosphere of bleak hopelessness and exhaustion which pervades both books. This atmosphere is in itself an archetypal image and represents an integral part of the story. The relevant elements from Sanctuary are as follows. A college girl, the daughter of an old-school Southern gentleman, sets off on a drunken spree with a pseudo-Southern gentleman who cannot hold his liquor. They are stranded at a remote house where an illicit whiskey still is run by a gangster named Popeye, for these are the days of Prohibition. This Popeye is a killer. He is also a degenerate with such a peculiar nervous constitution that he cannot touch alcohol and is completely and irremediably impotent. His lust, however, are aroused by the girl, whom he abducts after taking her virginity by a revolting device. It says, by the use of the core of a corn cob. An interesting parallel is provided by the ancient Greek custom of performing the deflowering, regarded as dangerous to the male partner, by means of an ithyphallic image of Leucippos, a girl who had been transformed into a boy. See Paulus, Real Encyclopedia, D. Class Altertum Swiss, Art, Leucippos. He then keeps her confined in a brothel in a neighboring town, satisfying his desires by watching her copulate with another man, whom he procures for the purpose and subsequently kills. There is an elaborate sketch of the brothel keeper, a large and imposing lady who compensates for her sordid occupation by an extreme gentleness in her private life. Under this treatment, the girl is completely demoralized, degenerating into an addict of alcohol and sex. She is eventually rescued, and Popeye, not being available, is persuaded by her terrible father to accuse an innocent man of her rape. This man is lynched by the angry mob, and Popeye is subsequently hanged, quite somewhere else, for a murder that he does not happen to have committed. This unedifying story closes with the girl and her father in Paris, under the leaden sky of a gray afternoon that will evidently continue forever. The parallelism of No Orchids is immediately evident. It opens with a conspiracy by a gang of small-time crooks to steal the fabulous diamonds worn by Miss Blandish, the only daughter of the local millionaire. At the holdup, however, they have the misfortune to kill her playboy escort, and since Miss Blandish was a witness to the crime, whom they dare not release, they decide to abduct her and hold her for ransom. On their way to their hideout, a remote house in the country, they have the misfortune to be seen by a member of the Grissom gang, big shots who cannot bear to see such a profitable proposition as Miss Blandish left in the hands of Small Fry. They therefore pursue the original captors to the hideout, where they murder them all three and remove Miss Blandish to their town house. Slim Grissom, the leader of the gang, is introduced as a pervert whose only pleasure lies in killing and torturing. Hitherto he had taken no interest in women, but he now falls irretrievably in love with Miss Blandish. The real head of the gang, however, is Slim's mother, Ma Grissom, a terrible old woman who has organized her son's success, relieving him of the responsibility for everything except the actual murdering. The only other noteworthy member of the gang is a handsome philanderer named Eddie, who is portrayed with considerable sympathy. After the ransom money has been collected, Miss Blandish's continued existence is nothing but a source of danger, and Ma would like to rub her out. Slim, however, refuses to allow it. He keeps her as a plaything and even gives her back her diamonds, which thereupon disappear from the story. Ma, in her maternal fondness, persuades Miss Blandish, with the aid of drugs and beatings with a rubber hose, to submit herself to Slim's bestial lusts, and in these circumstances she is held in captivity for several months. Her father, John Blandish, the millionaire, dissatisfied with the failure of the police to rescue her, hires a private detective named Fenner, who succeeds in tracking her down. The Grissom mob have by this time installed themselves in a fortified place, equipped with steel shutters and defended with great firepower. An army of police is mobilized, and this stronghold is captured after a great battle in which the entire Grissom mob, with the sole exceptions of Eddie and Slim, are eliminated in a glorious hecatomb. But this victory is unavailing, for when the police penetrate to the inmost recesses of the citadel, where Miss Blandish had been held captive, they find that she and Slim have flown. Their absence is due to the incident described in the introduction. Rocco, the rival gangster, has removed Miss Blandish, and Slim has gone in search of her. She has unaccountably resisted the attempt to restore her to her father, preferring to wait for Slim. Now he has her again, and he carries her off on his last flight. In the end, he is caught and shot down, and Miss Blandish recaptured. But once again, she unaccountably refuses to return to her old life. Of Slim, she says, "He's not dead. He's with me now. I know he is. At first, I thought I was wrong, but now I know I've got him with me. He wouldn't leave me alone, ever, and he never will." She then throws herself from a window, and thus ends the tale. But there is a bitter postscript. A rich lady whose car has been held up in the confusion resulting from Miss Blandish's fall from the window sends her chauffeur to inquire what has happened. On being told, she comments acidly that the victim was no doubt another silly girl who had got herself into trouble over a man. That, of course, is the true theme of the story, and in it we may discern a significant parallel with the Persephone myth. Persephone. Persephone, the virgin daughter of Demeter, was raped, or more politely, carried off to the underworld by its ruler, Pluto, or Hades. So also was Miss Blandish, her Pluto going by the name of Slim. Demeter, left forlorn in the upper world, approached Zeus, who in most versions was Persephone's father, with the demand for the return of her daughter. In some versions, she imposed her will by refusing to allow any vegetation to grow upon the earth in the meanwhile. Whether willingly or under this compulsion, Zeus acceded to her request, ordaining the return of Persephone to the upper world. But then it was found that while in the underworld she had eaten a pomegranate given her by Pluto, and in consequence of this he decreed that she must spend part of each year in the underworld with her husband, returning to her mother in the world above only for the remainder. In some versions only one seed, in others a part, either 1/3 or the half, of the pomegranate. Now this eating of the pomegranate, if taken as a rational explanation of Persephone's fate, is obviously nonsensical. In order to find any meaning in the story, we must interpret it symbolically. As I have already mentioned, the rule for doing this is to look first for the final outcome of the action, ignoring the explanations offered as to how and why it came to pass, and then to consider the action itself. To try, in fact, to discover what actually happened in the archetypal drama which the writer or mythographer is interpreting. In this myth, the final outcome is that Persephone, the daughter or princess of the upper world, is condemned to divide her existence between the two worlds. Each, in fact, has asserted a valid claim on her. The upper world claims her by right of origin, but the claim of the lower world came into existence in the course of the story. It is with the creation and establishment of this claim that the myth is concerned. What then actually happened? In the first place, the ruler of the lower world became enamored of the princess of the upper world and carried her off against her will. So far, no claim had been established, for Zeus, the supreme authority, at first ruled that Persephone be restored to her mother. Then, however, it became apparent that Persephone, during her sojourn in the underworld, had done something this time of her own free will, which bound her to her ravisher with a bond against which even the authority of Zeus availed nothing. The most that he could do was to obtain her periodical liberation for a limited period. We have not far to look for an explanation of Persephone's fateful action, for the pomegranate, for obvious reasons connected with its manner of bursting, has always had a sexual connotation. Cf. Pauly's Real Encyclopedia, D. Class Altertumsvis, Art Persephone. The ancient marriage custom in which the bride, on first entering her husband's house, was presented with a pomegranate as a love and fertility charm, and, with regard to the binding force contained in the eating of the pomegranate, the fact that Kore, i.e. the basic type of Persephone, is bound forever to the realm of shadows by her eating of the pomegranate, is an old fairy tale theme which occurs already in Egypt. The person who has partaken of food and drink in the world beyond is eternally bound to the underworld and can never again return permanently to the world of the living. Persephone, then, is quite simply bound irrevocably to the underworld by the loss of her virginity to her lover. We must, however, beware of interpreting this conclusion in outer world terms. The myth is no simple allegory based on the ancient custom of carrying off the bride, or anything superficial of that kind. The final outcome at once rules out such an interpretation, for the mortal bride belongs henceforth solely to her husband, and there should be no question of removing her from him, even for a limited period. We must seek the meaning elsewhere. Turning now to Persephone's own attitude in the matter, we find that her incarceration in the underworld is traditionally regarded as being distasteful to her. She is commonly pictured as longing to return to her mother, and their reunion is seen as an ecstatic fulfillment of hope deferred. But this might perhaps be a polite convention. We have in fact the opinion of 4 contemporary interpreters of this drama, who all quite unequivocally assert the contrary view. In the first place, we have the 2 stories under discussion, in both of which the ravished heroine is by no means anxious to return to the world of polite virginity. Faulkner shows her as merely converted to the vicious ways of the underworld, but Chase, sensing the underlying symbolism and bringing it out more clearly, leaves us in no doubt as to the person of her lover that Miss Blandish cleaves. This love, it is true, is represented in the most unattractive colors, and Miss Blandish is ostensibly its passive and unwilling victim. Nevertheless, she violently resists Rocco's attempt to deliver her from her supposed tormentor, and in the end, when her lover is taken from her, she follows him to the depths to which he has returned. Further evidence of her love will be discussed later. The next witness is Thornton Wilder, whose evidence is embodied in a playlet entitled Persephone and the Devil. The subject is a puppet show which goes wrong. The action is intended to represent the Persephone myth, but no puppet for Pluto being available, his part is taken by a conventional medieval devil. The operators are careless and inattentive, and in consequence Persephone twice throws herself into the arms of the devil instead of fleeing from him, in the second case preferring him to her mother, who has come to reclaim her. It is interesting to note that here the classical Pluto, who has come to be seen as a kingly and not unacceptable figure, is revealed in his true light. In antiquity he was held in such horror that his name was never mentioned. Lastly, we find the same theme in a book by a woman, Mary Mitchell's Warning to Wantons. This is the amusing story of a super-civilized and flirtatious French girl who is abducted by a jealous rival and deposited in the bed of a young peasant in a fantastically remote Balkan village. Hitherto she had lived for all the refinements of civilized luxury, and life in the village is inconceivably primitive and squalid. Nevertheless, although she, too, is rescued, she prefers to return to her rustic lover. Confirmation of this conjecture from classical sources is also not wanting, for both Virgil and Lucan show Persephone as unwilling to return to the upper world. The latter indeed represents her as having conceived such a repugnance and hatred for her mother that the latter in her despair became an addict to opium. Cf. Paulus Real Encyclopedia D. Class Alter Tum Swiss, Art Persephone, in which full references are given. On a superficial view, one might be inclined to advance the sordid interpretation that these stories have no more edifying message than that the enjoyment of physical love outweighs, for women, all other considerations. But that leaves the underworld element out of account, and most particularly it is incompatible with the undoubted mystical importance which the Persephone myth, in the form of the Eleusinian mysteries, enjoyed in the ancient world. The story must have some deeper meaning. One point which does emerge is the importance which virginity and its sacrifice play in the destiny of woman. Once again, the outer world implications of this matter are not sufficient to account for the creation of myths about it. It is an obvious fact that in most social environments, the role and status of an individual woman is completely transformed on the bridal night, and such obvious facts do not give rise to myths. We are not concerned with individual women, but with the archetype of womanhood, a figure existing in the universal mind. Until we have found out more about her, we must leave the question of who Persephone or Miss Blandish is, why she falls to such an ignoble lover, of what her mission in the underworld consists, and why she belongs to two different worlds.